The call came in the dead of night, quiet but heavy, like a storm about to break. The kind of call you don't ignore. The kind of call you take even when every bone in your body tells you to turn away. I'd been in this world long enough to know that when someone like the 14K Triad reaches out, you don't say no. You show up or you disappear. And I wasn't ready to disappear, not yet. Hong Kong's streets were slick with rain as I made my way to the meeting spot, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The city never sleeps, but at this hour, everything feels like it's holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. I'd heard the stories, of course, about the 14K, about their ruthless hold over the city, their hands in every dirty business, from drug trafficking to money laundering to smuggling. Everyone knew their name. Few had lived to tell the full story. I was just another small-time hustler. I ran numbers, did a few jobs for the local gangs, made enough to stay out of trouble, or so I thought. But when the 14K wants you, they don't care about your past. They care about your usefulness, your loyalty, and your silence. I had none of those qualities yet, but I was about to learn what it took to survive in their world. The meeting spot was an old, forgotten warehouse by the docks, a place where the city's dead weight gathered, hidden from the eyes of the law, the media, and the few who still cared to look. I had been here before, but tonight it felt different. The air was thick with the smell of salt water, rust, and something darker that I couldn't place. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. A figure stood in the doorway of the warehouse, barely more than a silhouette in the darkness. Tall, broad-shouldered, his presence like a shadow stretching over the ground. He didn't need to say anything. He knew I was here, and I knew he was waiting for me. The Triad doesn't make mistakes. They don't waste time. You don't get a second chance. "You're late," the man said, his voice low, flat, as if it had been dragged through years of violence and cruelty. I didn't speak. I couldn't. My mouth felt dry, my throat tight, as if my body already understood what was about to happen. I nodded once, a gesture that could have meant anything, but in this world, it meant everything. "Follow me," the man ordered. I did, stepping through the broken door into the warehouse. Inside, the air was even heavier, thick with the stench of oil, mold, and blood. The light from the street lamps outside barely penetrated the gloom, but I could make out shapesmen sitting in corners, watching me with eyes that were both dead and hungry. There were no smiles here, no warmth, just the cold, biting reality of a world where mercy was a weakness. At the far end of the warehouse, a figure lay on the floor, bound and bloodied, barely conscious. The faint glow of a dying light bulb illuminated the scene, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. His face was a mess, swollen, cut up, bruised beyond recognition, but there was something familiar about him, something I couldn't place at first. The man who had led me here stopped in front of the figure, motioning for me to come closer. "This is your first test," he said, his voice flat and cold. "Finish it." For a moment, I didn't understand. My heart raced, the blood pounding in my ears. I looked at the man on the ground, then back at the man who had spoken. The words sank in, but they didn't make sense. Finish it. Who was this guy? What had he done to deserve this? Then it hit me, the familiar face. The man on the floor was a small-time hustler, someone I'd seen around the streets before, someone who had crossed paths with the wrong people. He wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't supposed to be like this. But in the world of the 14K Triad, everyone was expendable. There were no innocent bystanders. There were no second chances. "Do it," the man said again, his tone leaving no room for hesitation. You want to be part of this. You want to survive. This is how it's done. I swallowed hard. The weight of the situation crashed over me like a tidal wave. I was standing at the edge of something irreversible. If I took that step, I would never be the same again. There was no going back, no redemption, no mercy. The gun felt cold in my hand. I had never used one before, never needed to. But tonight, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. I knelt beside the man, his eyes flickering open, locking with mine. There was fear in them, but also something else, something I hadn't expected. There was a plea, a silent cry for help, but I knew better than to listen. There was no help here, no escape. I raised the gun, my hand shaking slightly, but I steadied it. I could feel my heart beating faster, my breath coming in short gasps. My finger hovered over the trigger, and for a moment, I saw everything, the life I had known, the choices I had made, the path I was about to walk. It all flashed before my eyes. Then I pulled the trigger. The sound echoed through the warehouse, louder than anything I had ever heard. The man's body jerked once, and then he was still. The room fell into silence, the kind of silence that settles in your bones and never leaves. I stood there, staring at the lifeless body in front of me, my mind numb, my body frozen in place. The man who had brought me here stood behind me, watching with cold, emotionless eyes. "Welcome to the 14K, he said, his voice barely a whisper in the thick, suffocating air. "This is what it takes to survive." I didn't respond. I couldn't. The weight of what I had just done crushed me, but there was no time for remorse, no time for regret. Not here, not with them. "You're one of us now," the man said, his words carrying the finality of a death sentence. "And you'll do whatever we ask. If you don't, you'll be next." I nodded, my stomach twisting in knots, my hands still trembling from the violence I had just committed. But inside, something else had awakened a hunger for power, for survival. The 14K Triad wasn't just a gang, it was a way of life, and once you were in, there was no escape. I had made my choice, and now I was part of the darkness. I stood there in the warehouse, the weight of the gun still heavy in my hand, my fingers stiff from the grip. The body of the man on the ground had already started to lose its warmth, and I could still hear the echo of the shot ringing in my ears. It was a sound I would never forget, a sound that would haunt me for the rest of my life, no matter how many times I tried to drown it out. "You did well," the man behind me said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "But this is just the beginning. The 14K doesn't take weaklings, and if you want to stay alive, you'll do exactly what you're told." I nodded without saying a word. I didn't have the luxury of speaking, not yet. I wasn't even sure who I was anymore. The man had been a stranger, just a face in a crowd. But pulling that trigger, ending his life in an instant, had irrevocably changed me. I had become something else, something darker. We left the warehouse without a word. The man led me down the same path we had come, through the darkened streets of Hong Kong, past alleyways that reeked of desperation and violence. The city's skyline glittered in the distance, but the lights didn't offer any comfort. They only reminded me of how far I was from the person I used to be. As we walked, I couldn't shake the image of the man's face, the fear in his eyes, the pleading look he had given me just before the shot. He had known what was coming, just as I had known. But that didn't make it any easier. It didn't make the blood any less real. We reached a black SUV parked at the curb. Without a word, the man opened the door for me, his eyes never leaving mine. I slid into the back seat, and the door slammed shut behind me with a finality that made my skin crawl. The car began to move, the hum of the engine blending with the pounding of my heart. The city passed by in a blur of neon lights and shadows. The streets were empty now, as if everyone had gone into hiding, leaving only the predators behind. I didn't know where we were going, but I knew it didn't matter. The 14K controlled everything, from the streets to the hearts of men. And if they wanted me to follow them into hell, I would. Eventually, the car pulled up in front of a high-rise building that gleamed in the night, a monument to wealth and power. The 14K were not just criminals, they were kings, ruling from the shadows. The building was their kingdom, their throne, and it was here that I would begin my new life, or die trying. The man led me into the building, through a marble lobby that smelled of expensive cologne and leather. The elevator ride was silent, each floor we passed increasing the pressure in my chest, as if the very walls were closing in on me. Finally, we reached the top floor, where a set of double doors opened into an expansive, modern office. A man stood at the desk, his back turned to me. "Sit," the man who had led me here said, his voice cold and commanding. I sat, the chair feeling hard beneath me, as the man at the desk turned to face me. He was older, his face sharp with age and experience, but his eyes were still as cold and calculating as the rest. This was the one who truly held the power, the one who controlled everything. His name was Chen Wei, and he was the leader of the 14K. "Welcome," Chen Wei said, his voice smooth, almost pleasant. "I see you've passed your first test. But remember, there is always a price to be paid in this world, and you will pay it in ways you cannot yet understand." I swallowed hard, trying to maintain my composure. "What do you want from me?" Chen Wei's smile was thin, almost predatory. "I want you to prove that you can be useful, that you can be loyal, that you can survive. There are many who want to be part of the 14K, but few have what it takes. You've shown that you can kill, but that is the easy part. The hard part is keeping your soul intact." He paused, his eyes narrowing as he studied me, weighing my every move. I felt the weight of his gaze like a physical thing, and for the first time, I wondered if I was already too far gone to turn back. "We have work to do," he continued, his voice softer now, almost casual, "and you will do it. You will prove that you are one of us. But make no mistake, if you fail, we won't just kill you. We'll make sure everyone you know, everyone you care about, pays the price." I nodded, a tightness in my throat that I couldn't swallow away. The words he spoke were chilling, but they weren't empty. I knew that. I had seen the way the 14K operated. I had seen how they took what they wanted, leaving nothing but destruction in their wake. Chen Wei stood and walked to the window, looking out over the city below. "This city is a battlefield," he said, his voice distant, as if he were speaking more to himself than to me. "And we are the ones who control it. Not the police, not the politicians, not the people who pretend to be good. The 14K owns this city, and if you want to stay alive, you will do as we say." I felt my stomach twist, but I didn't dare show weakness. I wasn't here to back down. I wasn't here to apologize. I was here to survive. Chen Wei turned back to me, his eyes sharp and unforgiving. "Your first task is simple. We have a shipment coming in. It's valuable, and it's ours. There are those who would like to take it from us. You will help secure it. No questions, no mistakes. If you fail, you will answer to me." I nodded, my throat dry. I didn't care what the task was. I didn't care how dangerous it was. All the first cared about was surviving. Because in the 14K's world, survival was everything. And if I wanted to survive, I had to prove I could play their game by their rules. Chen Wei smiled again, the look of a man who knew he had just trapped me in a cage of his own design. Good, now go. You'll find out everything you need to know. The rest will come in time. As I turned to leave, the weight of what I had just committed to settled over me like a shadow. The 14K were not just a gang, they were a way of life. And once you were in, there was no way out. I walked out of the room, feeling the cold air of the city against my skin. The lights of Hong Kong flickered in the distance, and I knew one thing for sure. The man I had been before was gone, and the man who walked out of that building, he was nothing more than a ghost, already dead inside. The night air felt colder as I stepped out of the building, the weight of Chen Wei's words still echoing in my mind. The city stretched out before me like a labyrinth, streets that led to nowhere, alleyways where the light barely reached, and dark corners that seemed to swallow anyone foolish enough to wander too close. I had just crossed a line. There was no turning back. The black SUV waited for me at the curb, its sleek exterior reflecting the neon lights of the city, as though it were an extension of the 14K themselves, polished, powerful, and untouchable. The driver didn't say a word as I climbed into the back seat, but I could feel his eyes on me through the rearview mirror. He knew exactly who I was now, just like everyone else in the Triad. There were no secrets in their world. I didn't speak either. The silence between us was thick, laden with the weight of the unspoken. I wasn't sure what to say, and I wasn't sure if I even cared to. My mind was consumed with one thing: survival. The task ahead, the shipment, was just a test. A way to see if I had what it took to keep up with the ruthless, ever-expanding grip of the 14K. The car sped through the streets, the sound of the engine cutting through the silence like a blade. We passed through districts I had never seen before, areas that were even more run down than the ones I knew. The buildings here were crumbling, the streets littered with trash and broken glass. This was where the real danger was. This was where the Triad's power came from, the forgotten places, the dark corners of the city that no one ever looked at twice. We finally stopped in front of a nondescript warehouse, its steel doors rusted and grimy, the kind of place you wouldn't give a second glance to unless you knew what you were looking for. A few men stood guard at the entrance, their faces unreadable, their eyes trained on me the moment I stepped out of the car. They didn't need to say anything. It was clear what they expected of me. I approached the warehouse, my pulse quickening, my thoughts clouded with the weight of everything I had already done. The man who had led me here, one of Chen Wei's trusted enforcers, gave me a quick, almost dismissive look before nodding toward the entrance. Inside, quickly, he ordered. I didn't hesitate. I couldn't afford to. The 14K didn't waste time, and neither did I inside. The warehouse was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of oil and sweat. There were crates stacked everywhere, some opened, others sealed tight. The sound of men moving about in the shadows filled the space. A steady rhythm that spoke of an operation far more complicated than I had expected. This wasn't just a shipment of goods. This was part of something bigger, something far more dangerous. A man emerged from the shadows, his face obscured by the low light, but I could make out the sharp outline of his features. He looked like a shadow himself, his presence unsettling in a way that made my skin crawl. "You're late," the man said, his voice low, almost a growl. I swallowed, my throat dry. I was told to come, Chen Wei said this needed to be done. The man chuckled, a sound that held no humor. Chen Wei is not here, is he? He asked, stepping closer, his boots thudding on the concrete floor. You're the one who's here, so you better do as I say. I nodded quickly, not trusting myself to speak. The man seemed to sense my unease and smirked, clearly enjoying the power he held over me. Follow me, he ordered. I did, staying close behind him as he led me deeper into the warehouse. The place was a maze, the shadows shifting like they had a life of their own. We reached a set of heavy, reinforced doors, the kind you'd expect to find in a high-security facility. The man didn't hesitate. He unlocked the doors with a practiced motion and pushed them open, revealing a room filled with crates marked with strange symbols and codes. This is where the real work begins, he said, his voice cold and detached. The shipment you're here to protect is inside. But there's a problem. I raised an eyebrow. A problem? The man's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a grimace. The problem is that someone else wants what's inside these crates. And if we don't move fast, they'll take it from us. My heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just about a shipment anymore. This was a war waiting to explode. They won't get it, I said, more to reassure myself than to convince him. The man chuckled again, a sound that made my blood run cold. That's the spirit. But there's more to it than that. There are others watching, people who are paid to watch us, and if they see an opportunity, they'll take it. You'll need to do your part. He handed me a handgun, its weight cold and heavy in my hand. Take this. If anyone tries to take what's ours, you shoot. Don't hesitate. I nodded, my mind racing. This was no longer just a task. This was a battle. A test to see if I could keep up with the 14K, to see if I had the stomach for what came next. I wasn't sure if I was ready for this, but I had no choice. I had already crossed too many lines. There was no turning back now. The man moved quickly, organizing the men around us. I could hear the distant hum of cars outside, the low murmur of voices. We weren't alone. Whoever was coming for the shipment was getting closer, and I could feel the tension thickening in the air. Minutes passed in silence, the only sound the rustling of crates and the soft clink of weapons being readied. I kept my eyes on the door, watching for any sign of movement, any clue that the other group was closing in. My palms were sweaty, and I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I was ready for whatever was about to happen. Or at least, I thought I was. Suddenly, the sound of tires screeching on the wet pavement outside reached my ears. It was followed by the unmistakable sound of gunshots, the sharp cracks of bullets tearing through the night. A fight had already broken out, and it was only a matter of time before it reached us. The man beside me turned, his face hard as steel. "They're here," he said, his voice cold with anticipation. "Get ready." The room erupted into chaos. The atmosphere in the warehouse grew thick with the smell of anticipation, as if every breath we took was charged with the violence that was about to unfold. The distant gunshots from outside had stopped, replaced by the eerie silence of a standoff. We all stood frozen, waiting for the first sign of movement. The first indication that the storm was about to hit us head-on. Then it came. The door at the far end of the room exploded open with a deafening crash, splintering the wood into jagged shards. A group of men stormed in, their faces obscured by bandanas and dark glasses. They moved like wolves, quick, organized, and deadly. Each of them carried a weapon, their eyes scanning the room, searching for their prey. "Cover the doors," the man beside me shouted, his voice a command that sliced through the tension. He already had his gun drawn, his movements fast and fluid, like a man who had been in this position 100 times before. I followed his orders, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't sure what I was doing, but I knew I had to act. I raised the handgun, the cold steel of it pressing into my palm, and aimed at the men who had just entered. They hadn't seen me yet, and that was my advantage, but it was only a matter of time. The room exploded into chaos as the first shots rang out. The sound of gunfire was deafening, reverberating through the concrete walls, bouncing off the steel beams above. The men who had stormed in ducked behind the crates, using them as cover while they returned fire. The room became a maze of gunfire, ricocheting bullets, and shouted orders. I moved quickly, my body reacting before my mind could catch up. I crouched behind a crate, trying to steady my breathing, trying to make sense of the whirlwind of violence unfolding around me. The man beside me, my only ally in this madness, was already engaging the enemy, his shots precise and deadly. But I wasn't like him. I wasn't used to this. I was just a pawn, thrust into a game I barely understood. Focus. He shouted over the gunfire, his eyes locked onto mine. You have to shoot. Don't hesitate. I didn't hesitate. I couldn't afford to. I peered around the edge of the crate, my finger tightening on the trigger. My first shot was wild, too quick, too frantic. The bullet hit the wall behind the enemy, sending shards of concrete flying. But the second shot was better. I aimed for the closest man, the one who had been about to raise his weapon in my direction. The gun kicked back in my hand as the bullet found its mark, hitting him in the chest. He crumpled to the ground without a sound. I felt a strange rush of satisfaction, but it was quickly replaced by fear. The man I had just killed could have been anyone, just another face in the chaos. But in this world, it didn't matter. All that mattered was survival. The fight raged on, the sounds of gunfire becoming a steady rhythm, punctuated by the occasional scream or the sickening thud of a body hitting the floor. The enemy was fierce, determined, but the 14K were better. They had been doing this for years. They had the experience, the ruthlessness, and the firepower. It was a battle of attrition, and in a battle like this, only the strongest survived. As the minutes dragged on, I found myself moving on instinct, my body adapting to the violence around me. I had never imagined I would be part of something like this. Never thought that I would be standing in the middle of a firefight, fighting for my life. But here I was, and the only thing that mattered was getting through it. At some point, I realized that the enemy was retreating. They were pulling back, heading for the exit, leaving behind their wounded and dead. The men around me shouted in victory, their voices filled with the rush of adrenaline. The battle was over, at least for now. But as I looked around the warehouse, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The 14K had won, but there were always more enemies, more battles to fight. And as I stood there, the blood of the fallen mingling with the dust on the floor, I realized that I had just made a choice. I had chosen to fight, to survive, and in this world, there was no going back. The man who had been guiding me through this mess approached me, his expression unreadable. His hands were steady, but there was a coldness in his eyes that made me nervous. "Good job," he said, his voice almost neutral. "You held your ground." I didn't respond. My mind was still reeling from the violence I had just witnessed and participated in. I had killed, I had taken a life. And for what? To prove myself, to survive. I wasn't sure anymore. He gave me a sharp look, as if sensing my inner turmoil. "You're not here for your soul, kid. You're here to do what needs to be done. You can think about all that later, when it doesn't matter." I nodded stiffly, unable to find the words to respond. What could I say? I wasn't a part of the 14K yet. I was still just a rookie, a pawn in their game. But in that moment, I realized something. I wasn't sure if I wanted to be anything more than that. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by an overwhelming exhaustion. I was covered in sweat, my hands trembling slightly from the tension of the fight. The warehouse felt suffocating, as if the air itself had become thick with the aftermath of violence. "Get out of here," the man said, his voice rough, almost dismissive. "We've got cleanup to do. You'll be assigned a new task soon." I didn't hesitate. I turned and walked toward the exit, my steps slow, my mind still racing. Outside, the night was quiet again, the sounds of the city far below. The neon lights flickered in the distance, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly into the dark. I took a deep breath, trying to clear the fog in my head. I had survived, for now, but the question lingered, at what cost? As I stepped into the black SUV once again, I realized that there would be no easy answers. The 14K world was unforgiving. It was brutal, and it was the only world I had now, the only world I could survive in. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew this much. I was in deeper than ever, and there was no way out. The night's events lingered in my mind as I sat back in the black SUV, its engine humming steadily beneath me. The blood from the firefight had dried on my hands, but the weight of what I had just done wasn't going away. I had crossed a line one I couldn't uncross. Each life I had taken, each decision I had made, added to the weight in my chest. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't remorse. It was something else entirely, a cold recognition that I was in this now, deeper than I had ever expected. The city outside the window blurred into a ghostly haze, the neon lights flickering like distant stars, their glow casting long, unnatural shadows on the pavement. I thought about the others, the men I had fought alongside, the ones who seemed so sure of their place in the world. They didn't hesitate. They knew who they were, what they were meant to do. But me, I wasn't sure I even knew who I was anymore. I was just a piece in a game I didn't fully understand, following orders like a puppet on strings. We drove through the night, the streets passing by in a blur, until we reached a high-rise building that loomed above us like a concrete giant. This was the heart of the 14K Triad's operations, luxury mixed with danger. From the outside, it looked like any other corporate building, sleek and polished. But inside, the air was thick with power, secrets, and violence. The Triad's influence stretched through every level of the city, and this building was one of their many bases of operation. The SUV pulled into the underground parking garage, and I got out, following the enforcer who had led me through the warehouse earlier. The elevator ride was silent, the hum of machinery the only sound between us. As we ascended to the top floor, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into a trap. Or maybe it wasn't a trap. Maybe I was the trap. The doors opened to a spacious, minimalist office, walls lined with expensive art, and floors covered in sleek marble. A man sat behind a large desk, his back to us as he stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows. His silhouette was sharp, his presence commanding. This was Chen Wei, the man whose shadow I had been living under since I entered this world. He turned in his chair, his eyes immediately locking onto mine. His gaze was cold, calculating. It was a look that made me feel like I was nothing more than a bug under a microscope. "Sit," he said, his voice smooth, almost soothing. But there was no warmth in it. There never was with men like him. I sat, my hands resting on my knees. I didn't look him in the eye. That would be a mistake. In this world, respect was earned, not given. And to show weakness was to invite danger. You did well tonight, Chen Wei continued, his voice measured. But that was just a test, a small one. You've proven you can handle yourself in a firefight, but that's just one piece of the puzzle. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I understood what he meant. The 14K world was full of layers each, one more dangerous than the last. I had only scratched the surface. We have a problem, he said suddenly, his tone shifting. A competitor has been making moves on our territory. We need to show them that we won't be pushed around. You'll be part of this. This is your next task. My heart skipped a beat. This was what I had been waiting for, the chance to prove myself, to solidify my place in the Triad. But as the words left his mouth, a cold feeling settled in my stomach. I knew this wasn't going to be easy. Nothing in this world ever was. Who are we up against? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Chen Wei smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. The Wo Xing Wo. They've been moving into our territory, trying to take control of the drug trade we've been running for years. They're trying to challenge us, and we can't allow that. I didn't speak right away. The Wo Xing Wo were another powerful triad group, based in Hong Kong. They had a reputation for being ruthless, cunning, and absolutely merciless. To cross them was to invite death. To go against them was to gamble with everything. How do we deal with them? I asked, trying to sound more confident than I felt. We make a statement, Chen Wei said, leaning forward. We send a message. We hit them where it hurts. I wasn't sure what he meant by that, but the cold smile on his lips made it clear. This wasn't going to be a simple confrontation. It was going to be something far more brutal. A full-on war, if I had to guess. Do you understand what I'm asking of you? Chen Wei's eyes bored into mine. It was a question I couldn't afford to answer incorrectly. I nodded. I understand. Chen Wei stood, walking round the desk with the fluid grace of a man who was used to being in control. Good. The operation begins tomorrow. Be ready. I left his office with a sense of finality in my chest. This was the moment. My chance to step fully into the 14K, or my chance to die trying. The next day, everything moved quickly. The operation was in motion, and the city was buzzing with the undercurrent of tension. Word had spread that something big was about to happen, and the 14K didn't do things quietly. We weren't just going to show the Wo Xing Wo that we could take what was ours. We were going to remind them who controlled the city. The plan was simple. We hit them at one of their drug distribution centers, a warehouse on the outskirts of the city. We had information on their operations, who was involved, where they were, what they were doing. It was all laid out for us, ready to be executed. The enforcers were already gathering, loading up on weapons and getting into position. There was no room for mistakes. The 14K weren't known for being forgiving. The air felt thick with the promise of violence as we prepared for the assault. I was given a simple task: to guard the perimeter and make sure no one escaped. It wasn't glamorous, but it was necessary. And as the sound of engines revving filled the night, I realized that this was it. This was where I would prove myself or get buried in the aftermath. We arrived at the warehouse just as the first signs of dawn began to break. The place was dark, only the faint glow of security lights illuminating the outside. There was no movement, no sign that anyone inside knew we were coming. But I knew better than to trust that silence. The Wo Xing Wo were just as prepared for a fight as we were. The signal was given, and the assault began. The first shots rang out, followed by the sounds of men shouting, the clatter of gunfire, and the explosion of doors being torn open. Inside, chaos erupted. I stood at the entrance, my gun in hand, my heart pounding in my chest. This was it. This was my moment, and there was no turning back. The explosion that tore through the warehouse's front door was like a thunderclap, shaking the earth beneath my feet. It was the signal, the moment we had all been waiting for. Without hesitation, I pushed forward, moving as quickly as my adrenaline would allow. My heart was a drum beat in my chest, louder than the gunfire that echoed through the air. The 14K were unstoppable. Our goal was clear. We were going to crush the Woxing Wo, show them that we were the ones in control, and make sure that there would be no question of who owned this city. My heart was a drumbeat in my chest, louder than the gunfire that echoed through the air. The 14K were unstoppable. Our goal was clear. We were going to crush the Woxing Wo, show them that we were the ones in control, and make sure that there would be no question of who owned this city. I took cover behind a stack of crates, my eyes scanning the scene for any signs of movement. I couldn't afford to let my guard down, not for a second. The Woxing Wo might have been underestimating us, but that didn't mean they were weak. They fought back hard, their own firepower matching ours, each shot filled with intent to kill. The stench of gunpowder and blood mingled in the air, choking and suffocating. It was the smell of violence, the smell of war. I could hear the distinct sound of metal against metal as one of our men fired an automatic weapon, unloading a barrage of rounds into an unseen target. Then the thud of a body hitting the floor, followed by another and another. The Woxing Wo weren't giving up without a fight. I was about to move to a better vantage point when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. I spun, my gun raised, heart leaping in my throat. But it was one of our Zan enforcer, panting heavily, his face a mask of grim determination. "Keep moving," he yelled, his voice strained with effort. "They're trying to retreat. Don't let them get out." I nodded, adrenaline surging through my veins. I didn't hesitate this time. I was learning fast, adjusting to the madness around me. We weren't just trying to hurt them. We were making a statement. We were eliminating the competition, sending a message that no one could touch the 14K without consequences. I followed the enforcer as he moved through the maze of crates and equipment, his movements quick and calculated. The gunfire had slowed, but the tension remained thick in the air, like a storm waiting to break. We reached the back of the warehouse, where we saw two of the Woxing Wo members trying to flee through a hidden exit. They didn't even see us coming. The enforcer raised his weapon and fired. One of them dropped instantly, a bullet to the head. The other staggered, barely able to comprehend what had happened before he was brought down as well. No mercy. This was the 14K way. This was the only way to survive. "Move," the enforcer barked. "We need to clear the rest of the building." I followed his lead as we made our way further into the heart of the warehouse. It wasn't long before we encountered another group of the Woxing Wo, this time a handful of men holding their ground near the central office. Their leader, a man I had never seen before, was barking orders, his eyes wide with panic. He was clearly out of his depth, unable to comprehend the ferocity of the assault. Before he could react, one of my comrades shot him in the chest. His body collapsed without a sound, and the rest of his men scattered in all directions, desperate to escape the onslaught. But there was nowhere to run. Not from the 14K. The warehouse was turning into a slaughterhouse. Men fell one after another, each victim a reminder of how quickly everything could change in this world. One minute, you were in control. The next, you were nothing more than a body on the floor, forgotten and discarded. The screams were fading. drowned out by the relentless sound of gunfire and the occasional explosion from the damage we had caused. I was losing myself in it, lost in the violence, in the chaos. The idea that I was just following orders was starting to slip away. I wasn't just part of the 14K anymore. I was becoming it. Every kill, every movement, every breath taken in the middle of the bloodshed made me feel more and more like I was born for this life. We pushed deeper into the building, each room more dangerous than the last. The Wo were cornered, desperate to hold on to what little they had left, but they were fighting a losing battle. The 14K were relentless. It was then that I heard something I hadn't expected. A faint sound, barely noticeable, but enough to send a chill down my spine. It was the unmistakable whir of a helicopter blade cutting through the air above the warehouse. My head snapped toward the ceiling, my eyes searching for any signs of danger. But there was nothing. Move. The enforcer grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the back exit. Now, we ran, our footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The sound of the helicopter grew louder, closer, and then suddenly, the building shook. A deafening explosion rattled the walls, sending chunks of concrete and steel raining down around us. The force of the blast threw me to the ground, my body slamming into the cold floor with brutal force. For a moment, everything went black. When I regained consciousness, the world around me was a blur. My head throbbed painfully, and I could taste blood in my mouth. I struggled to get to my feet, but my legs were unsteady, as if the blast had scrambled my senses. The enforcer was already up, his face grim. "We're not done yet," he said, his voice low but urgent. "Get up. We've got to finish this." I nodded, swallowing the bile rising in my throat. The pain didn't matter. What mattered was the mission. What mattered was surviving. We made our way to the back exit, our steps echoing in the now sealant warehouse. The air was thick with smoke, the remnants of the explosion lingering like a ghost. But as we stepped outside, I saw it. The Wo were on the run, scattering in every direction. They were broken, and they knew it. But the helicopter wasn't just a weapon. It was a message. Someone had just sent us a warning. The morning after the chaos felt like the calm before a storm. The warehouse, now a burned-out shell of its former self, stood as a silent monument to the violence we had just unleashed. My body ached with the aftermath of the battle, bruises and cuts decorating my skin like badges of honor. But there was a deeper pain that gnawed at me, something that went beyond the physical. The memory of the helicopter, the explosion, the way the world had shaken around me, felt like an omen, a warning. The Triad wasn't the only force in play here. Someone else was watching. Someone powerful enough to strike back like that. We gathered in a safe house on the outskirts of the city, a place no one from the outside would think to look. It was a simple apartment, furnished in a cold, utilitarian style, but it was secure. The perfect place to lay low, to lick our wounds, and to prepare for whatever came next. But there was a tension in the air, something that none of us could shake off. The enforcers who had fought beside me that night were silent, their eyes hard, their thoughts clearly somewhere far away. It wasn't just the pain from the battle that lingered in the room. It was the realization that we were playing a game far more dangerous than any of us had anticipated. Chenwei had summoned us to meet in a back room of the safe house, where a few of his most trusted lieutenants were already waiting. The low hum of conversation stopped when he walked in, his presence commanding and cold. He didn't smile, didn't offer any words of praise for what we had done. His face was grim, his eyes narrowed as if he were already calculating the next move. The Wo Xing Wo are done for, Chen Wei said, his voice steady and unfazed. But what happened last night wasn't just about them. This was a message to us. Someone is sending a signal. His words hung in the air like a storm cloud, and for a moment, none of us spoke. The helicopter, the explosion, it wasn't just random. It wasn't some rogue attack. Whoever had orchestrated it had done so with the precision and coldness of someone who knew the stakes. Someone who had the power to strike at the heart of the 14K and not flinch. I couldn't suppress the shiver that ran down my spine. I'd been in this world long enough to know that when you made a move, it wasn't just the people in your immediate circle you had to worry about. There were always other players, always others waiting for their moment to strike. And now it seemed that moment had come. Chen Wei's eyes scanned the room, locking onto mine for a brief, unsettling moment. I could feel the weight of his gaze, the unspoken challenge in it. I was still new, still unproven. I had fought, I had bled for the Triad, but I hadn't earned my place yet. Not really. The look he gave me said it all. If I was going to survive this, I had to prove I could handle what was coming. "We'll deal with this quietly," he continued, his voice cold and ruthless. "But I want everyone to know that we're being watched. The 14K can't afford any more mistakes. From now on, everything we do will be under the microscope. No room for error." The others nodded, but I could see the tension in their faces. They were experienced. They'd seen it all before. But this felt different. There was a sense of inevitability in the air, as if we were all heading toward something we couldn't avoid. We weren't just fighting for territory anymore. We were fighting for survival. Chen Wei turned away, signaling the end of the meeting. As the others filed out, I remained behind, my mind racing with questions. Who had attacked us? Why? And more importantly, how were we going to respond? After everyone had left, I made my way to the balcony of the safe house, stepping out into the cool evening air. The city sprawled out beneath me, its lights flickering like the stars in the night sky. The skyline was beautiful, but I didn't feel its charm anymore. It had become a battlefield, a battleground where every street, every corner, every building held a story of violence and bloodshed. I pulled out a cigarette, lighting it with a flick of my lighter. The smoke swirled around me, filling my lungs, offering a brief moment of calm amidst the storm. But it was fleeting. I wasn't fooling myself. The storm was coming, and when it hit, there would be nowhere to hide. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every interaction, every conversation felt like it had hidden meaning. Even the smallest of actions seemed laden with significance. Chen Wei's cold demeanor had only deepened. The enforcers were more on edge than usual, watching their backs, speaking in hushed tones. There was a palpable sense of danger in the air, and I could feel it tightening around me like a noose. Then the call came. It was late at night, just as I was about to retire for the evening. I had just finished checking my gear, my weapon, my ammunition, my vest when the phone buzzed. The number was unfamiliar, but the area code told me it was from a nearby district. I hesitated for a moment before answering. "Yeah," I said, my voice low, trying to mask the unease creeping into my chest. "Get to the docks," the voice on the other end said, gravelly and urgent. "Now." No other explanation, no context, just that. I hung up without saying a word, my mind already racing. The docks, it had to be about the attack. Whoever was behind it, they were making their move now, and we had to be ready. I grabbed my coat, checked my weapon one last time, and headed for the door. The air was thick with the sense that something was about to break. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I knew that this wasn't going to be a simple meet and greet. The message from the helicopter wasn't over. It was just the beginning. The docks were deserted when I arrived, the cold air carrying the smell of salt and oil. The dim lights from the harbor cast long shadows over the concrete, and the sound of water lapping against the piers was the only noise that filled the night. But I knew better than to think it was quiet. In places like this, silence was always the prelude to something worse. I parked my car a few blocks away and approached on foot, moving silently between the shipping containers and the rusting metal of the old warehouses. My senses were on high alert, every step calculated, every corner checked. The docks had always been a place of shady deals and dangerous people, and tonight it felt like a trap. I reached the meeting point, a small, inconspicuous warehouse that had been used by the 14K for drop-offs in the past. The door was slightly ajar, and as I approached, I could hear voices inside. I didn't know who they were, but I knew they weren't friends. I reached for my gun, my fingers brushing the cool metal of the grip, and pushed the door open just enough to slip inside. The moment I stepped inside the warehouse, the air changed. It was thick with tension, like a storm was about to break. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from a few flickering overhead bulbs. The sound of murmured voices and footsteps echoed off the walls. But there was an underlying silence, as if everyone was waiting for something, waiting for me. I took a slow breath, steadying myself. I couldn't afford to let the uncertainty get to me. I had to focus. I had to be ready for whatever was coming. The last thing I wanted was to be caught off guard, not after everything that had already happened. The door creaked behind me, and I froze for a moment. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Someone had entered. I turned, but it wasn't anyone from the 14K. It was a man I didn't recognize, dressed in a black suit, his face cold and unreadable. He wasn't armed, but the way he carried himself suggested he was no stranger to violence. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice low but sharp. The man didn't answer immediately. He just stared at me, his eyes calculating, as though sizing me up. After a few long moments, he finally spoke. "Your boss is expecting you," he said, his voice smooth, almost rehearsed. "He's waiting inside." I narrowed my eyes, trying to read him, but it was impossible. There was something about his presence that set off alarm bells in my head. This wasn't a random encounter. Whoever this man was, he was here with a purpose. I didn't trust him, but I also didn't have much of a choice. I followed his lead as he motioned for me to step further into the warehouse. The air was heavy, and the deeper we moved, the more oppressive it felt. The sounds of the outside world, distant traffic, the occasional shout from nearby docks seemed to fade as we walked, swallowed by the endless rows of crates and shadows. The man led me through the maze of the warehouse, each step feeling like it took us further into enemy territory. My senses were on high alert. Something wasn't right, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The sense of unease was building inside me, a knot tightening in my stomach. Finally, we arrived at a large, steel door at the far end of the warehouse. The man reached for a keypad beside the door, inputting a code, and the door slid open with a mechanical hiss. The room beyond was even darker, but I could make out silhouettes of figures moving inside. "Go in," the man instructed, his tone firm but not unfriendly. I hesitated for a split second. This could be a trap. It could be anyone behind that door. Wo Shing Wo, rival factions, or even someone from within the 14K who had turned on us. But I wasn't in the business of second guessing. If I did, I wouldn't survive. So I pushed forward, stepping inside. The door slid shut behind me with a soft thud, and the room went silent. There were 4 men standing near the center of the room, their faces obscured in the shadows. I couldn't see their expressions clearly, but the air was thick with the weight of their presence. Each one radiated power, a dangerous calm that reminded me of the moments before a storm. It was the kind of energy that told you these men had killed before and would do so again without hesitation. One of them, a man in a long trench coat, stepped forward, his voice carrying in the stillness. "Good of you to join us," he said, his tone cold, but not unwelcoming. "We've been waiting for you." I didn't say anything. I wasn't in the habit of making small talk with people who could potentially end my life with a flick of their wrist. "Do you know why you're here?" the man continued, stepping closer. The others watched silently, their eyes never leaving me. I shook my head. "I was told to come. That's all I know." "That's enough," he said with a slight smile, as though the answer amused him. He motioned for one of his men to step forward. The man handed me a folder thick, heavy. It was official looking, the kind of file you'd expect to see in a high-level government office, not a backroom deal in a warehouse. "Inside that file is everything you need to know," the man in the trench coat said. "Everything that's been happening lately, everything you didn't realize was connected." He paused, his gaze cold. "You've been involved in something much bigger than the 14K, and it's time you understood that." I stared at him, my mind racing. What the hell was he talking about? Bigger than the 14K? Was this some kind of setup? But before I could ask any more questions, the man turned and walked to the other side of the room. "You'll have time to process it. For now, we need you to do something for us." I didn't like the sound of that. I didn't trust anyone here, but I had no choice. I had to stay calm, get the information, and figure out what the hell was really going on. The man paused and looked over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. "You're going to need to make a decision. The 14K can't protect you anymore, not from what's coming. But if you're smart, you'll know who to side with." I felt a cold chill wash over me as his words hit home. The 14K couldn't protect me. "What the hell are you talking about?" I finally asked, my voice barely a whisper. But he didn't answer. Instead, he handed me a file from the table beside him. "This is your choice," he said simply. "Now go, the clock is ticking." As I stepped back into the warehouse, my mind was a whirlpool of confusion and fear. Who were these men? What did they want with me? The file I held in my hands felt heavier with each passing moment. I couldn't shake the feeling that the world around me was about to collapse, and that I was standing at the epicenter of it all. I walked out into the cold night, my mind racing. The weight of the file in my hands felt like a chain, dragging me further into whatever storm was brewing. I didn't know who I could trust anymore, or if anyone had been telling me the truth. All I knew was that I had just made a choice, and it was one I couldn't take back. Back in the safe house, I opened the file. My hands were shaking as I flipped through the pages, the information inside revealing connections and alliances I hadn't known existed. The 14K wasn't the only player in this game. There were factions I had never heard of, a shadow war being waged beneath the surface of everything I knew. And at the center of it all, a name kept repeating itself, someone I had never heard of, but who seemed to hold all the power. As I read, a cold realization settled in. This wasn't just about turf wars. This was about something much bigger. The real enemy wasn't who I thought it was. The days that followed felt like a slow descent into madness. Each new piece of information I uncovered only led to more questions, more confusion. The The file had been clear about one thing. Everything I thought I knew about the 14K, the Triad, the City, was all a lie. There were powers at play here that were far beyond our understanding, far more dangerous than any gang war I had ever fought in. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus. My thoughts raced at night, haunting me with the faces of the men I had killed, the families I had destroyed. And now, as I stood on the edge of a much darker world, I realized I had become a pawn in a game far larger than I ever intended. The name from the file haunted me like a shadow I couldn't escape. The man behind it, or someone I had never heard of, but whose influence, stretched across continents, was pulling the strings, manipulating everyone from the highest levels of government to the darkest corners of organized crime. The 14K wasn't just fighting for territory, we were fighting for survival in a world where the rules no longer applied. And the worst part was, I wasn't the only one who had been manipulated. Chen Wei, the man I had once believed to be untouchable, was nothing more than a player in a much larger scheme. I had trusted him, had bled for him. But now I saw him for what he really was, a puppet in the hands of someone far more dangerous. It was time to make my move. The meeting was set in an abandoned building on the outskirts of the city. The address was no surprise. It was one of those places that everyone in the underworld knew but few dared to visit. It was a place for deals too dangerous to be seen by the public eye. A place for power struggles that could not afford to be seen in the light of day. I arrived early, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no turning back now. I knew that once I entered that building, my fate would be sealed. But I had no choice. I had come this far, and there was only one way out. I pushed open the heavy metal door and stepped inside. The air was stale, and the darkness was suffocating. I could hear the faint sound of footsteps ahead, moving in rhythm with my own. As I rounded the corner, I saw him, the man from the file. He was tall, dressed in a sleek black suit, and stood with an air of command. His face was sharp, his eyes cold and calculating. There was no warmth in him, no trace of humanity, just a predator waiting for his next kill. "You're late," he said, his voice smooth, almost mocking. "But I suppose it doesn't matter. You're here now, and that's all that matters." I didn't answer. I couldn't. Words felt pointless in the presence of a man like this. He stepped closer, his gaze never leaving mine. "I know what you're thinking," he continued, his voice almost to calm. "You think you can take me down? You think you can walk away from this? But you're wrong. You've already made your choice. And now, there's no going back." My hand instinctively went to the gun at my side, but before I could make a move, he raised his hand, signaling for me to stop. "I've been watching you," he said, his lips curling into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You're a good soldier. You've got potential, but you're not ready for the world I control." The silence that followed was heavy, like the weight of 1,000 unanswered questions. "You've been playing in the shallow end of the pool," he said, almost sympathetically. "But now it's time to dive deeper, to truly understand what's at stake here." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a fight for power. It wasn't just about territory or survival. This was about control of everything, of everyone. The man standing in front of me wasn't just a player in the game. He was the one pulling the strings, the one who could topple entire empires with a single word. I felt the weight of his words settle over me like a shroud. This wasn't the world I had bargained for, but I was already too deep in it. The choices I had made, the people I had hurt, they had all led me to this moment. "How do you plan to stop it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He smiled again, a cold, empty smile that sent a chill down my spine. "You don't stop it," he said. "You survive it. And in the end, you'll realize that survival is all that matters. Power is fleeting, but survival is eternal." In that moment, I understood. I understood that this wasn't just about loyalty. It was about survival, surviving in a world where the rules didn't exist, where the line between right and wrong had long since been erased. This was a world where only the strongest, the smartest, the most ruthless could thrive. And as the door behind me slammed shut, cutting off any chance of escape, I knew that the storm I had feared was already here. There would be no winners in this game, only those who managed to make it out alive. I wasn't sure if I would be one of them. As I walked away from the meeting, the weight of the man's words hung heavy in my mind. The Triad was nothing more than a piece of a much larger puzzle. The real war was being fought in the shadows, a war for control, for power, for survival. And as I stepped into the cold night, the city stretching out before me, I realized that I wasn't just fighting for the Triad anymore. I was fighting for my own life. In a world where alliances shifted like sand, and where no one was safe, the only thing that mattered was who you trusted and who you were willing to betray. The game had changed, and now there was no going back.